Old school RuneScape's meta is about to change. In less than a month, Tombs of a Mascot is coming. The third raid will bring a host of new magic weapons, new melee weapons, rune pouch additions, and other things that'll change the meta completely. But I thought it was time maybe to look back at the ways that the other raids have changed the game. In years past, the Theater of Blood and Chambers of Zarek changed not only the gear that they brought, the direct rewards, but they also changed the game in a lot of unexpected ways. So today let's go through some of those, starting with Chambers of Zarek, the first raid. Going from the bottom up, there's many ways that the direct rewards from raids actually changed totally like the way that the game was played. And while this blowpipe isn't exactly from raids, it really symbolizes the way that Chambers really changed combat for the most, which was Rigor. Rigor became the most strong prayer and the biggest DPS upgrade that range has ever gotten, and it made the blowpipe the terror that it was, and, arguably still is, even after a nerf. It was so strong that it out DPS'd every other range weapon, bar the T-bow, on almost every monster. High defense, low defense, it really didn't matter. Rigor just took over, and it became like one of the most strong DPS upgrades that has ever come into the game. And of course, with the way that it came in, with the being one of the most common drops and actually being made more common after the first initial period, it wasn't too hard to get. And of course, the blowpipe wasn't too hard to get either. It really rewrote the combat system, making range the go-to DPS on almost every monster. Even things like Grardar that had been typically a melee boss. And that's something that maybe we should have seen coming, but, when you're thinking about an upgrade that's coming as a prayer, it's hard to maybe apply that to everything existing and be like, okay, so now this weapon will be the strongest. But once people tried it out, it was pretty obvious. The Twisted Bow was another benefit of this, of range becoming the meta. And although people were shown the calculations and people knew that because it was similar to the old Hex Hunter bow, it would be extremely strong, I don't think people really understood how strong it was going to be until we got in game. Largely because the magic level and magic defense stats that the bow scales off of had been largely irrelevant for a long time. No one was trying to mage Commander Ziliana. No one was trying to mage General Grardor. But as soon as you got in game with the bow and started using that to scale the power of this weapon, people were like, oh my god, this is level of power that we've never seen before. Because you have to remember at that time, the Armadyl crossbow and the non-rigor blowpipe, that was the best in slot for range. And then suddenly the Twisted Bow comes out, and you're like, this stuff isn't even close. The claws are another great example of something that we just take for granted now, but really changed the meta. Not just in the way that it is the best DPS spec weapon almost everywhere, but in the way that spec energy just became way more important. When you have spec energy to dump into claws, that's instant DPS, and it's very reliable. And when alts came around and people started using spec transfer, claws were the main recipient of this. You didn't really need to spec transfer if you were just using a hammer, because after one or two hammers, almost every monster is just ready to be killed with your normal weapon. But claws, there's really no limit on how much DPS you can output if you have enough spec transfer alts. You just continue to claw spec, and that gets really extreme. The Bulwark is another reward from Cox that people don't really think about too much these days, unless you're a PvPer. Of course, it totally changed the meta of tanking in the wilderness. It's been one of the strongest defensive options ever since it came out, but it's had a lot of different uses throughout the years as well. While the initial concept was more of tanks will wield this and, instead of a weapon, that didn't really pan out as much. The special attack became very useful. As we said, the wilderness tanking became very useful. Sometimes you can flick it on and off for, just extreme range bonuses. Overall, it's a very interesting weapon and one that really changed and reinvented a lot of metas. And I'm really glad it's in the game. some of the more direct or indirect changes that came from Chambers were things like the Warhammer becoming like a must-have item. Now, like, don't get me wrong, before Chambers came out, it was still very useful. If you wanted to do Sire, if you wanted to do something like Corporeal Beast, or even General Guard, like, you really wanted one. A hammer was very good, and most people went for it. But if you didn't have one, it wasn't like you were locked out of playing the game. Most bosses you could do without a hammer, maybe a little slower, something like Calphite Queen, for example. These were all designed before the hammer came into the game. But Chambers really changed that. With Tecton especially, but to a lesser extent the Olm hands, if you didn't have a hammer, you were having a bad time. And it get to the point where these days you kind of expect that you're not going raiding unless you have a Dragon Warhammer, or at least a couple on your team, if someone wants to carry you. And that's kind of a level that the Warhammer wasn't at before that. And now it's like, that's just a given. Like, every Iron Man has to go for a Warhammer. Everyone has to have a Warhammer when they're coming on the team. And that's just something you accept. Let's switch these around a little bit because I want to talk about the Overloads and Herblore. While Herblore before was definitely useful for Iron Man to be able to create their own potions, Chambers brought in the level of necessity that was present in pre-EOC with your Herblore level, being that if you didn't have 78 Herblore at least, or preferably 90 Herblore to go on these raids, like, you were not going to be accepted into teams. People need to be able to create their own potions, especially if they're Iron Man. It definitely speeds up the raid when everyone can make their own overloads, at the very least their own brews, and that's something that became now a requirement for top tier PVM in a way that it wasn't before. And to a lesser extent, there's other skills like your mining level, your woodcutting level if you're chopping the tree, agility level, and stuff for like passing shortcuts and collecting the rope. And like these levels, like later fire making and woodcutting for and thieving for the puzzle rooms, although it didn't matter too much at the beginning. I like the way that Chambers really like gave value to these skills that weren't previously valuable much at all. But it's not something that we necessarily expected. The lance is here to highlight one of the missing rewards that I don't currently own, which is the Dragon Hunter crossbow, but also just in a way that the crossbow and the lance are very tied together, but it's also like an early example of a philosophy of how to do niches where you have a higher DPS increase for something that is only against particular monsters. And the T-bow was part of this as well. But we wouldn't have the lance if we didn't have the crossbow. It's just one of those things that became, kind of expected, where they're like, oh, there's a dragon weapon that we can use against the head and it's very good. Well, what if we could use that against some of the other parts as well? And I think that although people knew that the Dragon Hunter crossbow was one of the rewards, it's probably easy to overlook how much that affected the results and the meta for the years to come. The Zami Spear is in here because it highlights that when Chambers came out, it really increased the need to have a stab and a crush weapon, which wasn't necessarily a thing before. While Sire was weak to stab and Serb was weak to crush, those were relatively low defense monsters, especially once you use the hammer, and you could get away with a tent whip, you could get away with an arc light later on, you can get away with using range on Sire, and also those bosses just weren't as popular because people hadn't had a lot of high Slayer levels back then. But once Chambers came around, it was like, oh, for Tecton, you really need both a hammer and a crush weapon. And for Vasa, you really need a stab weapon. It became very, it became a niche that people cared about, was not just best in slot, but best in slot stab. And that was like, we didn't know that was going to happen because we didn't know that there were going to be crush and stab weak monsters in the raid. And that's something that really could happen with TOA. They could bring out some monsters where suddenly we're like, oh man, like the rapier is actually going to be really good now because we need a stab weapon. Or the mace is going to be really good because we need a crush weapon. Although crush has been like decently served in the past couple of years because of Nightmare and things like that. Moving on to Theater of Blood. When Theater of Blood was coming out, everyone knew it was going to be melee focused because of the rapier, the scythe, the Avernic. People were like, oh, okay, so Chambers was the range based raid, even though it had, Kodai and Ancestral. But during the raid, a lot of it is ranged, and then in theater, we're going to focus more on melee, and that's definitely what happened. For the rewards, the scythe immediately changed how valuable melee was versus many bosses. The scythe is just crazy in terms of DPS increase. It really is more overpowered than the twisted bow, I would say, just in terms of raw DPS output, and also in terms of how many different monsters it's useful on. It's good for Slayer, it's good for almost all the Slayer bosses, but also just regular monsters like Dark Beasts. It's good on all the God Wars bosses, at least 2 of them. Best in slot on Grodor once the range was nerfed, although, the Bofa is still quite good. And, of course, with the Crush option, became even more powerful once Inquisitor came out. But one thing I should mention also is that, with the Sangstaff together, the Blood Rune cost was just crazy. And it's gone down a lot now thanks to updates like Guardians of the Rift, bringing so many more runes into the game, and the Colossal Pouch. But overall, the Blood Rune thing, I don't think we really understood how crazy it was going to be, because it's easy to say, okay, this many Blood Runes per swing, this many Blood Runes per Sang shot, but you didn't realize, just because of how good these weapons are, how many different places you're going to want to use them. Especially in theater, we didn't realize, oh, okay, we're going to be using the scythe for pretty much every room in here. We're going to be swinging this nonstop. And Nightmare also, you're going to be swinging the scythe nonstop, so that's definitely going to use way more Blood Runes than you might expect. The Sangstaff also was just such a crazy item, because I don't think many people really understood how strong the healing was going to be. It's easy to say, okay, well, it's just a trident that's 1 more max hit, and it uses Blood Runes instead of scales, and it has a little bit of a healing effect. That sounds good. That sounds like a good weapon, and that's what we voted for. But then when it came in, it was like, oh no, you can do Olm with no potions. If you're doing a solo running method, you can, the prep becomes trivial. No preps are now the meta. Even for later on when challenge modes came out, the Sang is just so powerful, especially when it's overloaded. You're hitting high, you're healing, you're getting all that damage back, and it's to combine a best in slot item with passive healing like that is something that we had never had before. And I think that nowadays people really know how good it is, and it really changed a lot of metas. Even to this day, it's still reinventing the way that the Sire meta was changed. I'm sure once we're getting the Ward of Eladinus is coming out, Sang is still going to be very good, because it's going to have that extra damage percentage, which means extra healing. And then at somewhere like Fasani's Nightmare, for example, you got to wonder, how much more are you giving up switching off of that to a harm or even to the shadow when you're getting so much passive healing back. And of course you can still use it with Thralls or with Ancients or with what Vengeance or whatever spellbook you want to be on, which is very valuable. Justiciar was an interesting upgrade. I think when it was coming out, people weren't too excited for it because tank armor has never been as good as DPS armor, and that's a pretty consistent position throughout most of the game. They've been well, Barrows has always been slightly more defense than Bandos, but that doesn't mean you're going to use Barrows armor over Bandos, because Bandos, the strength bonus is way more useful. But I think people underestimated how much it would make alting viable to play multiple accounts, because it becomes very AFK. If your accounts are in extremely high tank gear with just full Justiciar, maybe a Bulwark, an Ellie perhaps, like that means that you don't have to worry about them dying as much. And you could just be like, okay, well, I have 3 or 4 alts on my screen, maybe all down the left side of your screen or something, and they're helping you at say, Zami, and you don't have to worry about them dying because they're in Justiciar, which means that you can play that many accounts without losing track of them, without having to, do a lot of actions to keep them alive, to make them eat food. Like, it really kind of boosted the way that alts were useful in terms of taking damage, in terms of adding DPS, and relatively inexpensive because they're one of the more common rewards. So yeah, Justiciar, I think even today we kind of underestimate the impact that it had on the meta, and I think the game would be quite a bit different if it wasn't here. In terms of the subtler impacts that Theater had on the game, you just have to look at something like the ham joint and other fast weapons. There's a lot of, when Nilo came out, people were kind of like, okay, so this is just tower defense, you just hit it. And that's kind of the truth. But in terms of optimization, there was a lot that people ended up wanting. They're like, wouldn't it be cool if we had an actual weapon that we could use that was 3-tick, because they had the event RPG, and then they came out with the ham joint, and then they're like, well, what if we had one that wasn't just from clue scrolls, you could go for it specifically, so they made the Swift Blade. Then the Swift Blade was, a +1 stab accuracy over the ham joint, so that was better, but then Inquisitor came out, and the ham joint went back to being better, and like, with the blowpipe being already 2-tick range, then there started to be some talk of maybe we can have some faster magic. Obviously, you want something with long range for some of the odd crabs here and there, like you were using Third Age Bow, people were using Craws. Later, the Bofa came in, and Chins and stuff. So there's always been a bit of a meta evolving from Nilo, and that includes some unique weapons coming in and some unique ideas and niches to be filled. The Infernal Cape is an interesting one because while it was extremely prestigious when it came out, and it was like, it's +1 strength or +1 max hit on every weapon, at least, so you want to go get it over the Fire Cape. It didn't really make or break your DPS in many places. However, once Theater of Blood came out and it was a melee-focused raid, it starts to become a big difference whether or not you have the Infernal Cape. And not just in a pure DPS way, but also in like a social way. Like if you're grouping up with a team and you have a Fire Cape, people are going to think about you a certain type of way. Versus if you have an Infernal Cape, you get a bit more respect. And I think it wasn't really until Theater of Blood and Theater of Blood free-for-all teams like started kind of taking off that you saw the rise of Cape selling and buying. Because people were like, to get in a good team, I need an Infernal Cape. To get in a good clan to run TOB teams, I need an Infernal Cape. And that's not even just the DPS. Like, obviously with the Scythe, 1 max hit can be more than 1 max hit. Also with things like the Salve in Bloat Room, like, it definitely matters. But yeah, the social aspect, I think, was very huge. I also put things here like the Blade of Saeldor. Obviously, the Blade of Saeldor came in because people wanted a rapier equivalent for Slash. But it's just interesting to think about, the way that the rapier kind of stood as this new tier, where they're like, yes, we have the whip, yes, we have the abyssal weapons, but now that the rapier's here, they're like, we want Slash and Crush options for this tier. Even though it wasn't really a new tier at the time, being still saving 75 attack requirement, but I think most people understood it to be a higher tier, obviously, and something that they wanted partners for in the other styles. And it's also, notably, it doesn't degrade. Obviously, the Blade of Saeldor did at the beginning, but then you could corrupt it. But the Rapier and the Mace, they don't degrade, and that became what people wanted. You have the Scythe, which is charged, and that's like a high DPS weapon, so that's okay. But these other weapons, they're like, we want something that doesn't degrade. And of course, the Lance also came out later to match that. So I think the Rapier is an interesting case in. It seems very simple, but it definitely shaped how the different updates came after it. And then I put the DSIM here to highlight the way that TOB changed account progression for Iron Men. In general, it used to be that you were trying to get your stats up to a point where you're like, okay, now I'm good enough to raid. And, maybe you would leech a couple chambers here and there if your team was going in a big mass or something. But because all you could really do was sit there and make food or potions, you weren't getting a ton of points. It's not a good way to try and get items in terms of points per hour. And generally, you're just better off sticking to your account progression until you get to the point that you can actually raid. Well, Theater is not that way. The way that Theater works, obviously, is just for participating in the rooms, you get a solid chance to get items. And obviously, there's the MVP system, so you're not going to have the best chance, but the chance of you getting an item when you're, say, wielding a tent whip with a full team of scythes versus wielding a DSIM and a rune crossbow with a full team of scythes is actually about the same. So it ended up being that people on their hardcores, people on their low-level Ironmans could group up with some friends and leech items. And while this hasn't been used by every Iron Man in existence, it's definitely an interesting point in terms of, Theater of Blood started off as this super endgame content, this super endgame raid that people were only doing when they had the max gear, and it ended up being this space where if you had friends, you could leech good gear on your iron. And I think that's very interesting and something that we may or may not see with Tombs of Amascut because of the invocations. We really don't know whether or not it will be viable for low-level players to get items. And I think it's probably good for the game if they can get some items, but probably bad for the game if it's easy to get all the items, as a lower-level player. I think probably a perfect medium would be some of the less valuable items like the Light Bearer, the rune pouch upgrade. Those should be able to be gotten with very few invocations. Low level players, they can get them. It's a nice upgrade. But something like Masori should be very rare for them, and I think they should have no chance to get the highest, the ward and the shadow. But I think mid to high level players should have a better chance at those things. And the top level players, I think it should probably decrease the rarity of the lower value items and decrease the chance, increase the rarity, and increase the chance of the higher value, higher rarity items, the more difficulty you have going on. We'll see, obviously, what happens. But I think that what I wanted to highlight here is that there's ways that we know the meta is going to shift, with the upgrades that we've already voted for. For example, Masori, not only is it going to increase range DPS quite a lot, with each piece being the equivalent of the Vam braces that we just got, and there's multiple pieces, but also it's non-degradable, but also it's the highest mage defense with no melee drawbacks. It's going to change the metas quite a bit. Not to mention the magic stuff, as we said, Sang's going to get very good. The Shadow's going to be extremely good, making mage viable at a ton of bosses. These are things we know about. I think what I'm looking forward to most is the ways that it changes the meta that we don't know about. What weapons, like the Warhammer, will become absolutely essential to have, whereas before, it might just be something that you may or may not have in your bank. What skills are going to become extremely valuable? Are we going to have a new a Herblore requirement in there? Are we going to have an agility requirement in there? Something that makes people say, okay, before I enter this raid, I actually need to get my skills to this level. what kind of items are we going to see in the future that are going to be valuable that people are going to ask for purely to be able to do this raid better, like the ham joint, like the Dragon Hunter Lance, like stab and slash weapons for the main hand melee. I think one thing that we can all agree on is that when Tombs of Amascut comes out, it's going to take a while to see the full effects on the meta, and that's one of the most exciting times to play the game. So I don't know about you, but I'm definitely looking forward to it. If you're new here, feel free to drop a sub, follow me on Twitter, and let me know what you thought of this video and what you're thinking about Tombs of Amascut when it comes out later in August. But until then, I've been the Duck Chris, and peace.